Veil of Quills is my favorite skill in Hellclock that clears buttery smooth, single target damage is great, and Wither provides a ton of safety. Now patch 1.1 brings a lot of changes to the build, but in my opinion, it's not only different, in a lot of ways it's better, especially when it comes to quality of life. Gone are the days of spamming all your potions to do all of your damage, and then watching as your damage slowly drains away. And as you can see on screen, I've got a few new friends. Thus far, I've played the build in Abyss, Oblivion, and Void, but I do expect that Veil of Quills is also going to be excellent in Ascension. So, let's get into things by talking about the Relics, Constellations, Blessings, etc. Then I'll wrap things up with a few changes I'd make during the campaign, and some tips and tricks about the build's mechanics. This is the first of a few videos I'm going to be making where I go over some of the builds that I played previously, revamping them for the 1.1 patch. So if that sounds interesting to you, do be sure to get subscribed. Also, if you want to see all of my videos, join my Discord, link is down in the description. For now, let's get into things. The core of a build is, of course, Mark of a Vulture. This is a unique Exalted relic that specifically modifies Veil of Quills to stack a debuff on enemies. When this debuff reaches 12 stacks, the stacks have increased a little bit since the original version, you get a Plague Explosion. This is why I think it is ideal to have at least 12 projectiles, so every time you're hitting an enemy, especially a boss, you're triggering one of these Plague Explosions. In addition, with Feathered Dagger, the projectiles can pierce an enemy, which causes you to hit them again, thus triggering multiple explosions per cast. These form the core of the build. Next up you have Written Promise, where spells gain a percentage of your conviction as damage, with this bonus scaling significantly with a Tier 4 Rank 5 relic. Written Promise is very important for damage scaling. As you can see right here, I have about 2350 base damage. This is another plus 600, as I'll always have enough conviction, or almost always have enough conviction, to keep the damage scaling active. Trust me, you'll hit way harder when you gain roughly like 25% of your damage as extra damage. Speaking of, how do you keep that conviction up? Peace and quiet. Casting Passage gives you 11% of your max conviction if there's an enemy near you. Pretty sure this is per enemy near you, as when I teleport into groups, I gain a huge amount of conviction. Also, you can take Blessings when run that scale this further. For additional damage, Bloody Doll. Each one of these guards, they're giving me spell damage. That's what Bloody Doll does, and yes, it does happen to have a really nice corruption on it. And then last but not least, Call the Guard, because minions equals damage, therefore more minions equals more damage. Now when it comes to the rare relics, I was trying to balance resistances, this makes gearing easier, Wither buildup to quickly stun bosses, Wither's technically different from stun, but functions the same way. Deal damage against blooded enemies, this is a very powerful damage multiplier, as you can very easily wither foes, doubling the bonus temporarily. And skill projectile amount, because more projectiles equals more damage. This build doesn't actually have a ton of different multipliers available, so it's a very good idea to try to balance yourself between the two that you have, or I should say between the two common ones, because in addition to that, you can get things like bonus to lightning damage. Early on, bonus to plague damage, increased plague damage will work, as will increase spell damage. Later, bonus to lightning damage and increased lightning damage works due to the conversion nodes on your constellation tree. So for your prefixes, look for plague damage, look for lightning damage, look for cast speed, aka cooldown reduction, look for crit chance, look for crit multi, and of course, for the implicit, look for the bonus to lightning, bonus to plague, skill projectile amount, or if you get really lucky and this only appears on granted exalted relics, +1 to max power orb. I recommend prioritizing the offensive stats on your larger relics, which leaves you free to focus on defensive stats on your smaller relics. This would be something like anti-magic, where if you can get to 95% anti-magic, you're going to avoid most non-physical damage. Also, this is a good place to get flat mana, because flat mana, when combined with percent mana, say from an implicit, scales up your mana pool, which scales up your conviction pool. And you can of course add on max conviction to make this even stronger. So ultimately, my approach here is offense on larger relics, defense on smaller relics, just because I find that's easier to manage. And if you're wondering why I'm using this relic, it's because it has +1 to Veil of Quills. This is an extremely rare and incredibly powerful corruption. If you can get these, your build's pretty much going to be set. Next up, I'm going to talk about Constellations. And I'm also going to allocate them just to show what you can do if you don't have all 40 points. So first up, there's two ways to approach this. If you need mana, unlock the Faith Path and fill out here. This will give you mana regen and power orbs. Alternatively, if you're totally fine on mana and you want more damage, fill out Expeditus. This gives you evasion, which on higher difficulties won't be a thing. It gives you some plague damage, and it gives you some fizz damage, which never actually gets used for anything. Now, the next thing to do is to come over here to the Plague Constellation. And for now, you're going to take all of these nodes like so. This is the increased damage and the plague damage multiplier. This one is very important. You're also going to fill out these, which unlocks a bunch of other constellations. However, you're not going to finish by completing this. Instead, you're going to come down here and fill out your power orbs. Then, of course, fill out Oxumare. This gives you a ton of cooldown recovery and makes it far easier to sustain all of your cooldown skills. Plus, it gives a good bit of damage as well. Now, here's where things get interesting, because after filling all of these out, you unlock the Conviction Constellation. You can fill that out, followed by the Elemental Resistance Constellation. This gives a good amount of extra defenses, especially if your Fizz Res isn't quite tip-top shape. Now, as a result, you unlock the Conversion Constellation. You take everything here, so that now, even though you are still just doing plague damage, because Veil of Quills was always plague damage, the lightning damage bonuses are also converted over to plague. So now, instead of just stacking plague damage on all of your gear, you can stack both plague damage and lightning damage. And here's where things get interesting, because you have 2 points left, assuming you had 40. You don't actually need these points here anymore. So instead, you drop both of those, leaving you with 4 points that you can invest down here for spell damage. This is a nice little damage multiplier. A second multiplicative effect. So these are add multi. The 15 plus the 15 equals 30. This is just straight up multi. This one is not 30 plus 35. This is 1.3 times 1.35. You do have to be low life, but you can use a menu option to disable automatically healing and automatically using potions, which I highly recommend doing if you're going to go this route. The only downside is you're a bit squishier, and you may end up proccing your cheat death or getting killed. But the end result here, let me confirm, is this constellation pattern. You have both agility and power orbs. Then coming over here for plague bonuses, this allows you to use lightning, conviction for defense, max res for defense, and then just a whole bunch of damage down here. If you don't feel squishy, you know what? Can you take damage first? Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, these two are kind of just viewer's choice. If you want to use something different, go ahead, spend the 8 points elsewhere. Just make sure to account for resistances on gear if you drop these two. Next up, we've got skills, starting with Veil of Quills. This is a projectile spell that scales incredibly well with additional projectiles, and it's the core of the build. The global buffs are Wither buildup and Stun buildup, which ultimately doesn't matter that much because it's your main skill, so you're going to be taking as many bonuses for it as possible. Now, everything else is a supporting skill of one form or another. Now, everything else is a supporting skill, such as Judgment, that lowers enemy resistances, and you specifically want to scale up the lowering of enemy plague resistance. In addition, the global buff of ailment duration, while not super helpful, is technically very slightly useful because Blight and Wither are ailments. Then there's Summon the Guard. This one you can keep at a lower rank because you don't actually care about the damage Summon the Guard does. It serves two purposes. Number one, to exist as minions so that your bloodied doll gives you more damage. Number two, global cooldown speed per rank. Shorter cooldowns equals more DPS. So even just leaving this at at level 1, levels and ranks are not the same thing, even leaving this at level 1 is plenty good. Next up, there's Prayer Vengeance, the crit buff that pretty much every build uses. This gives critical hit chance and critical hit damage. Activating it amplifies these effects. The goal here is to have a high enough rank to get as much of a bonus as possible, but a low enough level that you are resetting the cooldown for very high, if not 100% uptime. The more cooldown recovery you have, the higher level this can be. The global buff of crit chance per rank means that throughout your run, your crit chance scales up pretty darn significantly. And last but not least, the main purpose of Passage is mobility. It does deal plague damage due to lightning to plague conversion. It does technically build up ailments on enemies. However, I have not leveled it because I would rather have that very short cooldown to teleport around more, and also to build more conviction by teleporting into enemies with peace and quiet than I would to have the little bit of extra damage it adds. That said, that is a personal choice. If you'd rather have the damage, go ahead and level it up, and also put ranks into it as you're selecting blessings, because that does give you global cooldown reduction, which is useful for the rest of your build. Alright, next up, blessings. What should you select? In terms of blessing of foundation, target mana. Not only does this scale your defenses, but at tier 4 you get 500 flat damage, assuming you have around 700 mana at all times. Crit and elemental damage also have useful progression paths, and crit into projectile amount is very useful in the early game as you're first transitioning into Veil of Quills. Once you get to the late game, though, it is strictly detrimental because you'll have more than enough projectiles and you don't want to lose the damage. So, focus on mana, and I recommend banishing one or maybe even two of the options on Blessing of Foundation. This makes it much more reliable that you get the tier 4 blessing you want. For Veil of Quills, the most important blessing is +2 Quills. These projectiles can be further scaled, making them extremely valuable. Beyond that, try to get 1 Quills Velocity blessing. This feels really good, but it isn't strictly required. Again, quality of life. And after that, balance, damage, and speed. If you're able to sustain skill costs without issue, banish mana. Otherwise, don't invest into speed and take mana offerings instead. Now, for the remaining skills, blessing choices aren't that impactful. On Prayer of Vengeance, for example, pretty much everything's good. After all, crit is valuable, you want to get to 100%, and crit damage is also valuable to scale the damage you deal with a critical hit. Judgment allows you to lower enemy resistances. The most valuable offering is the Plague and Fizz reduction, but gaining things like AoE or reduced mana cost aren't bad either. I do recommend banishing Fire and Lightning reduction though, as this build does neither fire nor lightning damage. And on Summon the Guard, you want +1 summons, and everything else shouldn't matter if you've set your character up correctly. Though if you find you have a significant downtime on Guard's Rage, you can also lower the cooldown via a blessing. And push comes to shove, none of the options look great, higher's better for more skill ranks. Next up, let's take a look at the gear. First up, your weapon. Base damage is good. In addition to base damage, you could look for something like lightning damage, plague damage, or additional projectiles. Just as a note, the versions that have additional projectiles have significantly lower base damage, so if you have a bunch of projectiles from Relics, which I currently do, that version of a weapon is not advised. But between lightning damage, plague damage, and base damage, just use the best one you've got. For your left ring slot, you want crit chance. Bleed chance and also life leech are both options. Life leech is, if anything, detrimental to this build, and bleed doesn't do anything, so definitely go with crit. For your right ring, crit damage or base damage. Exactly which one is better? Well, it's complicated, because if you have the extra base damage from things like Blessing of Foundation, then base damage has a lot less value. Unfortunately, as you push into the higher difficulties, especially Void, being able to buy the tier 4 blessings gets far more difficult. So I'd say try both, see what feels better, and realistically between base damage and crit damage, you can't go wrong. For the hat, it comes with Fizz Res by default, and you can get max mana, so either pure Fizz Res or Fizz Res mana. The other defensive stats aren't that useful ultimately. For your chest piece, there are 2 good options. Don't worry about the life, but the Elemental Res is quite valuable. Or you could get Anti-Magic. This is a powerful defensive stat that gives you up to a 95% chance, based on your current mana versus the incoming damage and pseudo-random blah blah blah, to completely avoid fire, lightning, and plague damage. A lot of the game's deadly damage is elemental, so this is very powerful. But especially as you go into higher difficulties like Void, it's very difficult to get to the 95%. You really need primo relics and possibly some corruptions, so work on it as you can. As you can see here, I don't quite have it there yet. But one thing that would help is if I got more resistances on gear, then I used an anti-magic chest piece instead of my elemental resistance chest. For neckwear, conviction decay resistance, because the other stats don't meaningfully contribute to your build. For belt, cooldown speed. See the last thing I said. For pants, this is a good place to fix physical resistance, which I guess the lesson here should be, if you're going to go out and fight in an area full of cactuses, don't wear those assless chaps you've been thinking about. Get some good pants. Later on, though, you'll want to transition this to cooldown speed because cooldown speed directly translates into damage. And for boots, prioritize movement speed. After that, look for elemental resistance. Being able to cap res is certainly a lot easier when you have res on your gear. For your necklace, the accessory, you can either use mana or max conviction. I found that depending on what stats you have, how many max conviction suffixes versus max mana prefixes, all that fun stuff, it'll more or less be a wash. In my current gear, max mana ended up being better, but it's not that different either way. Then last up in the keepsake slot, early on, it's a good way to fix mana to get hybrid mana and minus mana cost, but later you want mana and cooldown speed because again, cooldown speed is damage. Now let's take a look at the Great Bell. I'm not really going to spend time talking about things such as soulstone gain, gold gain, hellclock time. These are core mechanics or resource generators. If you're farming things, well, obviously resource generation is good. If you want to improve your gear, if you want to improve your relics, more soulstones are good. On the other hand, interacting with core game mechanics like being able to banish unwanted blessings or taking the red portals is pretty darn important. So you have to spend quite a few points filling out the base mechanics to get the tree to what I would call a pretty functional state. And yes, technically things like the cheat death, second wind, is personal choice. You could just get good and never get hit. However, my default is always to take these, and if you find, oh, I'm clearing levels and I never take damage, that's when you should drop it. Where things get more interesting are the optional points. In this case, I recommend scaling anti-magic. This is that defensive stat which I mentioned is quite difficult to cap in higher difficulties. There are some anti-magic nodes here, and there are some anti-magic nodes branching off of a mana path down here. You kind of want to be in both of these places anyway. Here, to build around conviction, you can even get conviction from mana spent and scale your mana cost for even more conviction generation. And you can also invest into the mana shield defense, which will cause a portion of your damage taken to go to mana, which could very well save your life. If you combine this with a relic effect that allows you to recover a large amount of mana from using a potion, you're going to be in a pretty darn good spot. The mana shield nodes are right next to the anti-magic nodes, so there's very little investment to taking them once you're at a point where you can sustain the mana costs. But if you can't do that, or you're early on in your scaling, then just focus on conviction from mana spent, conviction gain, and of course conviction decay resistance. These are very good stats to have and increase your total defensive pool, which remember is also scaling your damage. So if you want to play this during the campaign, what changes should you make? First up, you cannot play this in Act 1. Why? The skill and the relics simply aren't available. The other big change is that it's a lot harder to get a big mana pool at low levels. A majority of your mana comes from a combination of flat mana suffixes, typically on small relics, and percent mana prefixes, or ideally, faith imbuements on small relics. However, once you obtain Mark of a Vulture and Bloody Doll within Act 2, you can switch over to the build, and it more or less functions. From there, you want to slowly add the other supporting relics, such as Feathered Dagger or Call of a Guard. One thing I found helpful was adding in the Colonel's Insignia and Bombardment. This gave me another button to hit and a nice amount of AoE damage, which really helped with that awkward transition from whatever I was playing in Act 1 to this new build in Act 2. From there, fill out the remaining uniques as you progress through and reach Act 3. You won't have passage until then, so you can pick up Holy Water and start getting some conviction. Plus, this is the point where you do want to use that plus 100% projectile minus 30% damage Blessing of Foundation, as you won't have enough projectile scaling across all of your gear and relics to really get the threshold that you need. The skill starts taking off as you get to 12, because then you're consistently triggering the explosions. Once you complete the campaign, things really take off. Not only is it easier to start scaling your conviction, but you get lightning conversion, which makes damage much, much easier. You don't have to get plague damage, now you can use plague or lightning interchangeably. And so, last up, I have a few tips and tricks. The first of which is stutter step. Don't just stand still casting, but also don't run around not casting. You want to cast, take a small step, cast, take a small step. This allows you to deal consistent damage, and it is especially good while clearing, but also give you the mobility that you need to not feel rooted in place and hopefully avoid boss attacks. Next up, and most importantly, in the early gearing phase, try to get to 12 projectiles as soon as possible. This requires 300% total projectile amount, or plus 200%. And once you get to around the 235% total amount, is when you stop taking the 100% projectile blessing, because at that point, it's just a damage loss. You could probably honestly stop taking it around 200%, but either way, doesn't end up feeling that good, even if it does mean you trigger the explosion more consistently. With it appears you're going to be triggering it pretty darn fast anyway, even at 200% or 8 projectiles. Now, third up, don't underestimate Wither. This is one of the ailments inflicted by plague damage, and it has the effect of freezing enemies in place, acting like a stun. You can use this to interrupt boss moves, and you should pay attention to it because if the enemy's bar gets pretty close to 100%, you know now is the time to stand still, get those casts off, and deal some damage, rather than moving away or playing it safe. And because of this, it can be well worth your time to grab a Wither buildup relic. It doesn't directly increase your damage, but indirectly it contributes quite a bit. Next up, mana cost isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can mean more conviction, generated by the conviction from mana spent stat, and lower cooldowns through more Oxumare triggers. As long as you're able to sustain your mana cost, it's not a bad thing to use relics to continually scale them up. Though I do recommend grabbing a potion recovers mana or passage recovers mana, just in case you get yourself into a little bit of a bind. And last up, as I was playing through this character, I noticed there was a struggle point when I got to around 40 to 60k conviction. This is where I felt more than comfortable in Abyss, but I wasn't quite comfortable in Oblivion. I more or less had the damage to kill things, but I didn't necessarily have the defenses to tank hits. So if I made some mistakes on a boss, I would very quickly end up dead. The way I solved this was paying more attention to the flat mana on my relics, especially the small ones. So if you're feeling squishy, check your relics, make sure you don't just have a bunch of resistance suffixes. Remember, you can always shift that resistance burden over to more resistance gear and get something else on your relics, like mana. And so that's it for the new and improved Veil of Quills. I really like the peace and quiet playstyle. It means I can fairly aggressively teleport into packs of enemies and gain a lot of conviction for doing so. Plus, I no longer need to continually spam potions for all of my damage, leading to a much more consistent experience. And if I happen to get hit, lose all my conviction, it's fine, as my Constellation will immediately restore all of my conviction, making it quite easy to cover for some mistakes, especially if second wind procs. There's a very good chance you're going to be able to recover and finish the fight. I'll admit, the minions do add a little bit more screen clutter, especially with damage numbers on, which can make it generally difficult to see boss mechanics. But as long as you turn the screen clutter, aka the damage numbers, off, the build is still very enjoyable to play, and oh boy does it clear as smooth as butter. Now, if you're wondering a little bit more about the crafting system, how I made some of my relics, I have a new crafting guide that just came out. It'll be linked up in the card and down below. And again, like I said at the top of the video, I am making a series out of this where I'm going to revisit several of the builds that I played in Hellclock 1.0 and talk about the new and hopefully in most cases improved versions for 1.1. So again, if that sounds interesting to you, do be sure to get subscribed. For now, I'm going to get going. So thank you very much for watching to the end. If you liked it, leave a like. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.